Okay. 3, 2, 1. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining today in a very special event talking about how to defend UAE companies and government against cyber attacks in a more offensive manner. And I'm very pleased today to have a number of distinguished speakers with us today that I rarely have seen together, and it hopefully will enjoy. Today is also a very unique way because what we actually do is this is an in-person event at JW Marriott Marquis Hotel in Dubai, and at the same time is being broadcasted out internationally. So there's a number of technicians who are working this all, and hopefully it all will go very smoothly. All the attendees are muted. And if you have questions, put them in the chat box and it will be picked up, and you can either ask questions at the end of a session, or you can wait till the end and we'll have all speakers bring them up, and maybe there's some general questions you'd like to ask. Hope everything is well. And with that said, thank you very much for being here today, and we look forward to hopefully a great education this morning today. The first speaker is Chris Kubeka. I'm very pleased to introduce her in a second, but before we do that, can I bring the agenda first back for 1 second? Yep. So we have 3 or 4 speakers. The first one is Chris Kubeka, which is a cyber warfare expert, and we'll tell a bit more in a second about her, who's going to talk about cyber warfare and ethical hacking and how this all plays out in today's world. And as a second speaker, we have Darwish, is DCISO from Emirates NBD Bank, but unfortunately he's remote and the connectivity was not sufficient, so we asked one of his right-man people, VP of Threat Intelligence and Vulnerability Management, to speak with us. His name is Diraj. That's then followed by another speaker from Dubai, Taufik Ali, who is from Emirates Airlines. He will share a number of insights, particularly about how to make inventories of all these breach points and threats that are coming at you. And the last speaker is Thomas Hornung from Synack, and he will actually go in a bit more of a technical discussion on what you can do to better protect your organization against these kind of cyber attacks. So with that said, let's go over to the slide presentation of the first speaker. Her name is Chris Kubeka. Chris Kubeka is a very distinguished person. I'm very happy to have her here today. I met her, I think, 2 years ago in the Middle East Institute speaking event, because Chris is one of the very few, very unique, colorful persons I've met in my life, and there's not so many, because when she was like a young girl, she was already hacking in the Ministry of Justice in the US and broke in, and actually was forbidden to use a computer for 8 years as part of the settlement deal. Since then, I know she's been in the Air Force, US Space Command. I know she has now her own cybersecurity firm, but has also been involved in, for example, with Aramco, when Aramco was hit in 2012 by the Shamon attack, which took entire Aramco out. She brought them back into business. She writes multiple books. I think one of the latest books is how to use OSINT, open source intelligence, to break into IT, IoT, and SCADA environments. And I know she's a military advisor and also advises multiple governments, which she doesn't say much about, but I know she's probably involved in these kind of activities. So an incredible genius person. And last but not least, before saying that, she also won the award to be the #1 female hacker in the world. So the best in the whole world in terms of hacking. Well, that's quite an accomplishment. So I'm very, very pleased to have her this morning up early because she's in Amsterdam to join us today. So we're going to do a switch to her. Thank you, Chris, for being with us. And I give it go ahead. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. I am so pleased to see everyone here. And I'm going to be talking about a topic that is near and dear to my heart, cyber warfare and the role that ethical hackers like myself can come into play. Now, Ron gave me a very great introduction. I did get started when I was a wee little girl, and did unfortunately get busted for hacking into the Department of Justice and the FBI when I was 10 years old. Trust me, they did not expect to see a pigtail wearing little girl caught red-handed, nor did I expect a bunch of gentlemen in suits. But since then, I have done a lot of good things and identify as an ethical hacker. In addition to running my own company, I am the distinguished chair of the cyber program for the Middle East Institute, where we try to set technical policy that is actually implementable, both for the United States and for the Middle East and Northern African regions. My area that I love, my favorite happens to be SCADA systems and control systems, but also especially in industrial IoT. I used to head the information protection group for Aramco, and I got my start and refined my skills and became more of the ethical hacker part when I was in the US Air Force, both as an aircrew member and when I was with Space Command, where I dealt with something called command and control systems, which was twofold. One was ensuring that certain types of intelligence data came through correctly in dealing with that sort of stuff, and also protecting the telemetry data and the telemetry information about our various space assets for Space Command. Now, what's interesting about technology is, well, it can be great. And I think all of us, especially those remotely, understand that technology is this great enabler. We can speak to each other from across the world at almost any time of day, as long as we have an internet connection. We can connect our computers, we can share information, and it's fantastic. Unfortunately, there are times when it is not so fantastic, when that type of information can be manipulated, or there are denial of service attacks, or there are what has been in the news quite a bit lately, ransomware. But all in all, I like to say nothing is crazier than nation state crazy. We have entered this realm of a fifth domain, and using the technology that we depend on so much in our everyday lives, from clean water, electricity, ordering something online, the logistics to get our food supply, can all be tampered with by nation state actors. Now, this is complicated with many security challenges. There are lots of ways in and out of organizations. And typically, the longer an organization has been online, the greater the risk, because there are many times that we have these things called orphan assets, where we completely forget about something that is plugged in but doing an important job. Or it could be something that is plugged in, exposed to the internet, and used as a pivot to get into something more sensitive. Now, security isn't easy. If there was an easy button, I think that probably half of the security vendors out there would be out of business, but it just is very, very difficult for everyone to do. There are so many different variables. Now, when we're looking at the Internet of Things, there's something like 5 billion devices that are Internet of Things currently plugged into the internet in some way, shape, or form. And now that we have this new type of technology that can connect, can give us information from polling events on industrial systems to our home alarm systems, that opens up this new area of large number of access points, entry points, exit points. And we have to be very concerned, because unfortunately, the majority of the vendors who deal with Internet of Things, IoT devices, some can be fly by night, some can be established, but their primary goals are connectivity and, of course, when you're in business, profit. The vast majority of IoT devices are not looked at and thoroughly tested for privacy or security. And this can get us into real trouble. There's also the challenge that there is an assumption of security. Now, I have run into a lot of organizations where they assume if they have a firewall or some other type of protection mechanism, everything's fine. But at the same time, it's so easy to misconfigure these things that it turns out that that assumption is completely false and leaves these big gaping holes into their networks. So we have to think about that. And also, another challenge that many of us face at organizations is when you set up your project, usually the first thing that you're thinking of isn't security. And then suddenly someone mentions, hey, we need to apply security with this. And so it typically gets bolted on, or there isn't the available budget until after something goes public, and then you have to deal with it. And usually in those cases, the level of security is not going to be as good as if it was actually included as one of the basic steps and thoughts about a project. So then we enter the sticky subject of geopolitics. Now, I highly recommend this book. It's also written in a very humorous manner, called Who Hates Whom? It's a bit out of date, but not that much. And the thing is, there are many countries and many cultures in this world. Not all of us are friends. Some of us are enemies. Some of us are frenemies. You never know how things can go. Recently, France has recalled its ambassadors from the United States because of a defense deal between Australia, the US, and the United Kingdom, even though they were close allies. So you never know how things will go. And what's interesting about the Middle East and Northern African region is there are a lot of proxy wars that go on, a lot of cyber proxy wars. And it's one of the reasons why I'm so interested in the region is I see very interesting and sometimes advanced attacks occur in the region of the Middle East and Northern African region first, almost as a test bed, because there are a lot of different nation states involved in the region. And then a year to 3 years later, the West will get hit with a very similar attack that's been refined. So since many of us watching or attending in person are in this region, or deal with this region, we have to be aware of the fact that you're a hotspot right now. Now, when I say security is hard, it's difficult. All of the pictures that you see here from GCHQ, Boeing, and National Security Agency, all of these various groups I've been able to successfully, legally, and ethically hack into because they're larger organizations. They weren't aware of various assets that were out there. They forgot about them, or they weren't being tracked in a very good way, very accurate way. And if, for example, the NSA has a difficult time with cybersecurity, everyone is going to have a difficult time. Now, we've also entered into this realm where things like ransomware and other types of malware that is used for profit is now being used by various nation states who may be sanctioned and need to raise funds. So there's money out there. It isn't just cyber criminal groups. It's actually particular countries who need to raise money. There's also the sticky subject that some regimes, some nation states, and some terrorist groups, they want to destabilize certain things, whether that is an arms negotiation, trade negotiation, or just to, unfortunately, start trouble. But there's also this really big challenge for people like me and others who are ethical and legal hackers is when we find major issues, how do you report them? And it's been very difficult because the majority of larger organizations still do not have what's called a responsible disclosure program. As a matter of fact, even after dealing with GCHQ and the National Security Agency, they still do not have one. Boeing now has one only because of a report that I wrote. So then steps in people like me. And what is an ethical hacker? Well, an ethical hacker is a person who sees something and tries to say something and do something about it. Now, I do want to stress you should not leave your security policy in the hands of an ethical hacker, but we're actually a group where when we see something, we try to help. And it's very easy to miss a misconfiguration, or even after a pen test from a big organization doing a pen test on your organization, they might miss things. You can't get everything. So that's where ethical hackers come in. They try to tell you, hey, you know what? We just found this major problem. And we think that if you do X, Y, and Z, it'll fix the problem. But for right now, it's exposing, say, employee data or research and development data or whatever it may be, to please close this as soon as possible until it can get fixed. We're kind of like, how should I say, like a hacker guardian angel. And we try to make the world, at least the digital world, a better place. And for the most part, the majority of ethical hackers, their goal is to not only help, but also to get some acknowledgement. Fun fact, most ethical hackers love stickers. Most of us are not in it for the money and are more than happy to help out where we can to avoid a bigger problem. Because, for instance, if you are in the business of making planes or satellite systems, that's a hot target for nation states. So we would prefer if those particular systems were secured versus if a nation state was able to get into them, because many of us can understand the consequences of what can occur. And at the same time, we can be a very hot commodity for some good countries and some, we'll just say, some more nefarious countries. And after I came public with a particular sanctioned country trying to recruit me specifically to teach them how to hack critical infrastructure with a focus on nuclear facilities and trying to offer me loads of money, I actually found out I was not that unique in the ethical hacking world, that many of us have actually been given such offers. Thankfully, many of us have turned them down. But we need to be aware that the helpers, because of some of this type of espionage and bribery, can easily be turned the other way, especially if we don't get acknowledgement, which can be very difficult at times. I personally do not like jail cells, so I'm off the table for anything like this. Now, as we move forward, when most of our countries are trying to look at different ways to incorporate green energy. And these are examples that I'm showing of how easy it is to get into various things as an ethical hacker, and things that can be easily missed. So solar, wind, geothermal, etc. We all want a better world for ourselves, our children, our grandchildren, etc. But even when it comes to different types of green energy technology, these are now Internet of Things, either Internet of Things or industrial Internet of Things. And as we can see from the picture, it's fairly easy to find wind turbines that are exposed to the internet. Several years ago, when I worked with GCHQ, they asked me to do a sweep of all of the United Kingdom wind turbines to see if I could easily find them and if they were doing basic security. And I was able to find quite a few wind turbines in the United Kingdom, and about 82% of those wind turbines had a username of admin and a password of admin. So this is a problem. Think about what a nefarious person or nation could do with this. Could they adjust the wind turbine? Could they turn it off? And here in, again, the wind turbine, it's being set up to produce electricity first and foremost. But at the same time, it's web enabled. It has a login and you can control it remotely. And they need to be security testing because they are running a computer that can be exploited. Now, many of us are connecting remotely. So big shout out from Amsterdam. And it's a great thing to be able to do that. But at the same time, a lot of things were connected during COVID and very hastily, very quickly. And we needed that to be able to keep the world running. But when you turn things on or set things up very quickly, the first and foremost thing you're thinking of is availability. The first thing that an ethical hacker or a nation state that wants to get into your systems is thinking is, well, you set it up very quickly. That means that it probably wasn't tested for the configuration. There's probably going to be misconfigurations. There's going to be systems that weren't patched, and there's going to be a lot of exploitable points. In addition to that, one thing we have to understand is many employees have been sent home. We're still under work from home orders, I guess you could say, in the Netherlands. And when we sent our employees home, we sent them home to a home grade network, not the regular, normally much more secure corporate grade network. So I like to say BYOH, bring your own house, because now the corporate internet is in your living room or your library or your den or whatever room in your house. That same connection and the same way that you connect your work computer can be shared by your children, your teenagers, your neighbor, if you didn't set up your Wi-Fi correctly. And so you don't know what other dangers are there. Very rarely have employees been sent home with commercial grade firewalls. So now you have to depend on how strong your employee's household lock is. Let's say you're in certain types of fields where intellectual property can be very important to a nation state. Well, it's not that difficult to break into a house nowadays by getting in through the lock if someone isn't home. But it's much easier, obviously, remotely if the home router has various vulnerabilities that can be exploited. And think about this: when is the last time you updated your home router? And routers in general seem to be a big weak point when it comes to home networks, and very easy to bypass and get into by a nation state. So you may have heard some news articles where various ethical hackers tried to contact people with various weak routers to leave messages and say, hey, your router is really weak. You need to update the firmware. I can see your personal files, and then give a fix-it list to a lot of the individuals. This is even more important nowadays when your company's intellectual property or other information could be sitting there. An ethical hacker will try to do this before, say, a not so ethical hacker, many times working for a nation state, will use that to their benefit. And that's the last thing you want. Now, when we talk about IoT, there's a lot of different Internet of Things. And believe it or not, when you see this picture, the fridge and the power it holds, someone actually wrote a movie about killer refrigerators. I do not recommend it. But I was involved recently in a case with a US org, and they had set up an organization to talk about some of the governmental activities in a Middle Eastern country. And this was not taken too kindly. And that particular country has what's called patriotic hackers. They're a bit different than an ethical hacker. They usually work in some way, shape, or form for government, or their activities are decriminalized. And this particular group of patriotic hackers used smart fridges, smartphones, and a bunch of household level IoT devices, which were easily exploitable to attack this US organization. So the very things that we use in our house, a nation state can use our own appliances against us. So your fridge isn't just keeping your milk cool, it's actually, or could be involved in a hack attack, or even something that is more criminal, like a spam or pump and dump. So we need to be aware of the fact that these different IoT devices can be used for great things, but unfortunately for bad things. And if you ever find a note that's put out by your printer, a group of ethical hackers did this, printed out a sheet from people's printers and corporate printers and said, your printer's on the internet. It's exposed a bunch of your organization stuff. Please fix. Here are the ways that you can actually fix it. But you want to listen to these ethical hackers because you don't want your fridge to be used in a nation state attack against you. And there are many different ways. We now even have complete smart house systems that act as a hub that will connect all of your internal cameras, for example. That's the last thing you want online. Now, when we talk about UAE, one of the things that is quite important is the fact that there's a lot of shipping. And a couple of years back, before COVID, it's hard to remember the pre-COVID times, myself and a group were actually asked if we could hack a boat and steal it. And because of some of the things that you see on the screen, the different types of communication systems that are involved in cargo ships, for example, or the automatic identification system, which identifies the type of vessel that your boat may be, and also buoys and things like that to avoid collisions in maritime operations. And we had a lot of fun because actually we were able to remotely hack and steal a very valuable boat. And so we need to be aware of the industrial IoT systems that are in maritime. The automatic identification system is a protocol, like many protocols. When it was built, it was not built for security. And so recently I spoke with the US Naval Academy on some of their training and how maritime cybersecurity needs to be more incorporated. Because imagine if suddenly you think you're tracking a bunch of cargo boats and then they're flipped and switched. And now you think that you are tracking a bunch of military boats that are in your port. And the way that the automatic identification system is set up, this can actually be done and has already been used in one particular very interesting type of almost physical attack in the Middle East. Ships, unless they're military vessels, the larger the ship, the less physical control typically a captain will have. And many times they're actually controlled on the civilian band GPS system. And we already know of several ways that the civilian GPS system can be exploited. And so we need to watch out for this and understand the different risk factors. Then we also come into the different types of communications that are connected to industrial IoT. And I have found even on the internet some of the ways to actually connect to vessels because their routers, their industrial routers are connected to the internet and can actually be bypassed, and things like surveillance can be put onto those routers. And many of the operational systems inside the larger boats like cargo vessels and oil tankers are running older versions of what's called Windows CE, so older trimmed down versions of the Windows operating system, which in and of itself, they can be vulnerable if we don't do proper risk analysis. So hopefully you don't get a message from an ethical hacker that your ship is being exposed to the internet. But if you do, please take it seriously, because you don't want a not so friendly nation state to be able to find the same information and take your boat. And one of the big concerns with UAE especially is entering the space race. And some great news is that about 2.5 years ago, the United States FCC finally mandated that satellites and new space IoT must use encryption. What that basically means is there wasn't even encryption that was required up until 2.5 years ago. And space is rather unique where once you put something up, how do you change it? How do you change around the hardware if it didn't used to use encryption and you need to add hardware to it? How do you patch it effectively? It's an industrial IoT system nowadays. And unfortunately, the systems that they connect to, the land control systems, are typically not very secure. Recently, the particular article you see for the tweet, "In space, no one can hear cybersecurity professionals scream," from the Register in the United Kingdom. This was put out a couple of weeks ago. There was a report attached to that news article that stated that NASA had not properly classified many of their systems because unfortunately, many engineers thought it was just too difficult. So they just wrote critical system. Nah, we don't have any. And they've suffered over 6,000 attacks, many of them from nation states, in the last 3 years, ranging from malware on the International Space System and on certain satellites to an employee mining Bitcoins on their supercomputers. So a wide range. But because space is so integral into everything we do, think of navigation, think of aviation, think of getting from point A to point B. When's the last time you opened a physical map? Payment systems, communications. We depend much more on space than most people realize unless you're involved in the space industry. And if, for example, I can find vulnerable land control systems and tell them about it to say, I now can access your particular control system, which I have found is connected to a space asset, take that seriously. Because the last thing that we want is a space war. It might sound cool, it might sound James Bondy, but the problem is it can have very devastating effects. Now, when I was with Space Command, one of our missions was to try to protect space assets, not only from a nation state, but from nature itself. And you may or may not have heard of different types of solar flares. And you have to be very careful with that because it can basically obliterate your space assets or many different types of space assets. So we had to move our space assets or try to into a safe area, because if enough miscreants or if enough things are destroyed or in pieces, right now we have this big problem with space junk, space bits that are flying around at 6,000 miles per hour, and we can only track so many. And there was something that was proposed not too long ago called the Kessler syndrome, where if enough stuff is made into space dust, it can cause a chain reaction to then destroy everything in that orbit and create a space dust cloud, which would then make it nearly, if not impossible, to exit the orbit of the Earth and to get communications out. And if you are curious, there are now many nations who are trying to address this problem. But imagine if a nation state was able to do something like that. That would be a very bad thing. So it's quite important to listen to ethical hackers and cybersecurity professionals who have experience in the space industry to go, hey, these are the problems. We'll try to help you fix it. But the last thing we want is for this to get to the point where we have our own dust ring and we can't leave and go to places like Mars or to mine asteroids. And if you're curious, there will be a Tomorrow Unlocked episode with me in it describing some of this and how easy it can be as an ethical hacker and also nation state to hack into space assets. This is a very important topic because we all want to advance our technology, and space is a very important part of that. So when I say that there are a lot of things online, what I tried to do with this graph, although it's skewed because the United States has such a large number of things, is in the yellowish, that's the total number of things that say hello online. And there's quite a few of them. And in the orange graph is the number of these assets which have known exploitable vulnerabilities that depend on remote access. Meaning if I can find it and it's specifically known to be exploitable based on the remote access. So it's easy to pick and choose and pluck things off the internet. And it can be quite startling because this is now increased because of the amount of things that we have hooked up to COVID. Because of COVID. And as an ethical hacker who tries to be responsible to tell governments or organizations that this can be a problem, be sure that you know what you have online. You do not want a nation state or for your organization who, for instance, isn't even involved in some sort of military application or whatever, to be used as a pawn because of geopolitics. Cybersecurity and geopolitics are basically marrying each other in a very uncomfortable marriage because of the fact that the cyber and now space domains are coming into play when it comes to dealing with world politics. So I do have some recommendations, and I will say I'm probably biased because I live in the Netherlands, and one of the reasons why I live here is we have very good guidelines on how legal, ethical hackers can tell organizations or even governments what is wrong and then try to help them fix it. And it's the responsible disclosure program. If you are a company of a certain size or make a certain amount of money, you have to have a published responsible disclosure program in the Netherlands so that legal, ethical hackers can contact you. And if, as an ethical hacker, you also find exploitable vulnerabilities in a Dutch government system, you actually get a T-shirt like the one pictured that says, "I hacked the Dutch government and all I got was this lousy T-shirt." I do want to stress that type of acknowledgement is usually fantastic for an ethical hacker. Most of us aren't in it for the money. Another thing I want to stress is looking at active defense. Now, many of us in our organizations, you can't do everything when it comes to technology. So when you have a third party that is managing some of your security appliances or things like firewalls, make sure that you have a team that can do a review after they make a major change, because it's so easy to leave a big gaping hole for just even a major change or sometimes even a minor change. Now, we've been in this mindset where when it comes to cybersecurity, we are so used to putting out the fires, and instead of thinking in terms of being the smoke alarm and alerting before a fire gets out of place or there's just a bit of smoke. And so one of the things I recommend is, instead of looking at it just from the point of view of a computer emergency response team, we think of it as a computer emergency prevention team, and actively looking to see, do you have orphaned assets? Has the pen test covered everything? Taking a look at what's coming down the line from ethical hacker groups, and constantly looking in a proactive way of using, for example, open source intelligence gathering on your systems. And one of the ways that we can flip the narrative from putting out the fires to addressing things before there is a fire and there's only a bit of smoke is by looking at national policy. Think about how, for example, again, the Dutch government mandates you have to have a responsible disclosure program, and you have to have a secure way for, say, an ethical hacker to contact you. It does not stipulate that you have to have a bug bounty, for example, but just a secure way to contact you. In this, organizations and governments then start thinking in terms of, instead of the ethical hacker being a scary hoodie wearing person, more like a helper who is trying to fill the gap, especially in the sense that we still don't have enough people for cyber defense. But there are a lot of curious people who have a lot of knowledge and want to help the situation. Now, I tried to leave enough time for questions. Thank you very much, Ron, for inviting me. If you want to contact me further on my Middle East Institute profile, there is my contact information as well. And thank you so much for having me.
Great. Thank you very much, Chris, for your speaking engagement. Any questions? I think I saw one coming in, Peter, if you want to look. On WhatsApp also.
Let's see.
Any questions from the audience?
I love questions. I love to answer questions.
No questions? I think it's all good. You have any question coming in? Look in your WhatsApp. You want to put it on the mic? You can turn on your microphone. Turn it on.
Okay, so there is one question. As a UAE government department or company, what are the top things you recommend we do to minimize the risk of being breached?
Can you hear the question, Chris?
What are the top things I would recommend to avoid being breached?
Yes, to minimize the risk of being
To minimize the risk. Well, one of the things I would definitely do is make sure that there's a way that people can tell you if they find a problem, but in a secure manner. The last thing you want is, for example, an ethical hacker to tell you via plain text email, and your email accounts are a prime target for a nation state to look at these incoming things. Another thing is definitely try to have a proactive team. Recently, I helped I actually wrote the feasibility study for part of the European Union to set up one of these computer emergency prevention teams, which go out and actively look at all times to see if there is critical infrastructure or industrial IoT that might be at risk. And it goes out and it searches the internet on a constant basis and sets up various alarms so that it can be told the system very, very quickly if there's a problem, so that it can then be addressed as quickly as possible, because it's just so easy to leave a system open with a keystroke. And then, for example, a nation state to take advantage of that, or a criminal group. So think about that. Proactive, active defense, because the more proactive you are, actually the less money it's going to cost in the long run. Recovering from incidents is huge versus setting up a polling system that scans using various tools and then tells you before someone else can find that issue. So those are my two big recommendations.
Yeah, why don't you ask the question? Yeah, you have the microphone. 1 second.
Chris, this is one of the attendants from Al Khayat Investments in the Middle East. There's a question which has always been in my mind. I'm a certified ethical hacker myself. So very happy to meet a person who's like me, thank God. And you're right, we are the good guys, right?
Yes.
But okay, coming back to the nice feedback which you gave in the last half hour, 1 hour, I want to ask you one simple question. How do we as ethical hackers or someone who's into the cybersecurity space address the human factors gaps? Most of the times I find that there are human factors gaps in cyber defense and cyber security. So how do we address these gaps? This is something which we have always missed in all the seminars, in all the presentations that we would be looking into. We only talk about the higher levels of technologies, the IoTs, the blah blahs, all linked to the CS space. But I have never seen something which I would be very happy or happy to know about. How do I, as a human in IT, in my company, tackle the human factors gaps in cybersecurity, especially in COVID times?
Well, one of the things that I've found is sometimes we can expect a bit too much out of everyday people when it comes to security. We're not security experts. Not everyone is, I should say. So there's got to be easier ways. One of the recent examples I saw was, for instance, Apple iPhones made it very easy to turn on a privacy switch. There are other small instances of that, but not enough. And I would say in the long term, being able to push back on technology companies to go make it easy for people to do this. But in lieu of that, people have to understand why it is important. Why would it be important for me to lock down my smartphone or set a proper username and password on my smart fridge, or to not share credentials at work? And we have to take it down to the human level in order to do that. If there is a reason to make sure that people understand the need to lock their door, then they're going to lock their door. And nowadays we understand that, yeah, we should lock our door, but we don't understand we should also lock our smartphone or our home camera or whatever it may be. So we need to make sure that people understand why it's important to them. How easily, for example, they could lose money. Now, last time I was in UAE, I think it was in May, June, there were signs on the highway from a particular bank, I can't remember which one, talking about how to avoid fraud on your smartphone. And I thought that was very interesting because that's something that appeals to people. They might lose their bank account money if their app, for example, is hacked because their smartphone is hacked. And if we get more down to that level, then it's easier to understand. But right now, it is such a challenge because security for everyday people is not very easy, and it can also be kind of expensive too. Making sure you have a smartphone, for example, that can be updated, or an appliance that can be updated, or during COVID times, budgets may be lean. And so you can't get a printer or a server or a new software license that then puts it into a maintenance system where it can be patched. It's difficult. There are no perfect answers to this one, but if we humanize it and understand some of the challenges that everyday people face and bring it down to that level of this is the reason why in very simple terms, then I could see much more success than the unfortunate current way we do it of why did you click on that link? Because nowadays these things are so realistic and security is difficult. I hope that kind of answered your question, even though it's not a perfect answer.
He said thank you.
Any other questions? Good. All right, Chris. Well, thank you very much for being here. And I know it's a bit early. Can I put the camera on me? It's a bit early for you today, but thank you. And it was a great enjoyment to hear all the strategic assets and issues around security, and that you're trying to make a big difference in the world. So thank you very much. And then what I would like to do is to switch over to the next speaker. As I indicated, Darwish couldn't, the CISO from Emirates MBD Bank, is in a remote area with poor connectivity, so we didn't want to take the risk. So we're so kind for Diraj Sadi Haran. He's Vice President of Threat and Compliance Management at Emirates NBD Bank to speak to you today. And the topic he's going to speak about has to do with backdoor threats and how to mitigate those type of threats and risks. As you can imagine, in banks, they're tied into other systems and technology vendors, and that has become a big topic recently. With, for example, the huge breach with SolarWinds that was the backdoor into a lot of major organizations that caused a tremendous amount of damage around the world. So I'm very pleased to have here my favorite friend. So Diraj, please come up.
Thank you, Ron, for that very kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. Darwish unfortunately could not be here, but this is a program close to my heart, so I hope I will do some justice to the topic. I manage threat and compliance as my day job, and part of that is to manage offensive security operations, which is a very exciting topic, and cyber supply chain assessments. So, cyber supply chain attacks are not really very new. If you go a decade back, RSA, a security solutions provider, was compromised successfully to get unauthorized access to Lockheed Martin, who's a defense contractor for the United States government, right? But nowadays, these attacks are being more prevalent across industries and across the various services that affect us. These can be IT service providers such as Wipro, a public code repositories such as GitHub, network solutions providers such as SolarWinds, which Ron already mentioned, and ransomware attacks that literally affect the supply chain, such as in the case of Colonial Pipeline, where their servers were locked out due to a ransomware attack, and that affected their ability to distribute fuel in the United States, right? So this is now how they're hitting much closer to home across the industries and services that we take for granted. And why is this the case? Because now we are living in a very hyper-connected, converged world where everyone is connected to everyone, right? And that has now created this ecosystem that we really need to manage. So how do we really do this, right? How do we try to manage this large attack surface that is now prevalent in the industry? Our suggestions are around certain principles that we follow. We try to be pragmatic, right? We're not trying to boil the ocean, right? We have to concentrate on those suppliers who create the maximum risk for us and have the maximum compliance exposures for us. We are a bank, so that we are very heavily regulated. So for us, compliance is also a very important criteria for us to try to identify our critical suppliers. We try to be collaboratives. So it's not the responsibility of one single security unit to try to manage the vendor estate across business lines, products, and IT vendors, right? And in today's environment, every business product or service has an IT element that creates an exposure for you, right? So you need to engage your business lines because they are the subject matter experts in what they're trying to achieve out of this engagement. And that then helps you identify potential risks that you need to manage. Have great oversight. This includes having good procedures, processes, good inventories of third parties. Many a time we're sitting blind to the kind of vendors that our businesses are exposing to. So you should have a good inventory of your vendors. Generic oversight we see does not work. If you just run from a standard playbook, it really doesn't help. So it's good to have great oversight. Don't let this be a paper collection exercise. So basically, we don't want people and teams to just collect evidences that is meaningless, right? Try to engage with the vendor to understand their environment so that you truly understand the exposure that is. So that is a balance from our experience from two perspectives. One is you should have a team that knows what they're doing, right? And then you should have a vendor that is responsive. If it does not work, if one way, if you have a great team and don't have a good vendor, or a good vendor and the team can't consume the output that they're giving, right? It needs to be both ways. and have clear accounting responsibilities for roles and how you'd manage that. So these are some of the principles we think that help in managing your cyber supply chain very well. And because we are a large organization, we have these challenges which we think that most organizations that have a large footprint will have around supply chain management. One is having an inconsistent approach across the geographies that you're operating in, right? Other than a few regional requirements that need to be incorporated, it is always important to have a consistent approach towards doing third-party or cyber supply chain management. We usually find that if you have a centralized approach or a centralized unit that governs all of this and have a global approach, it helps in trying to mitigate this challenge. Coverage of all products and services. This is a big one because it's very difficult to ensure 100% coverage, and I have another slide that just shows how far and how deep this can go into. So ensuring coverage is important, and how this is managed or how we typically try to do it is we have embedded onboarding processes, which is embedded into the procurement programs, ensuring that you have an up-to-date and complete inventory and a continuous monitoring approach. And there are different ways that we do continuous monitoring. Risk assessment accuracy. Too many times, too many organizations gets in the pitfall of having a large, complicated risk questionnaire, right? And so this means that vendors don't understand how to respond to it. The answers are complex, right? It needs to be simplified and needs to be translated into simplified risks that can be consumed by your executives as well, right? You will have a complex assessment procedure which nobody can consume, so then that effort does not really bear any good fruit. Data protection requirements. Now, it sometimes is very difficult for vendors across geographies to meet data protection requirements across all the geographies that you are exposed to. So you need to take a risk-based approach, is our recommendation. Prioritize on the critical data elements and work with vendors remediation for acceptable remediation practices. And then again, a lack of due diligence. This is usually managed through continuous monitoring processes, ensuring that you have embedded processes and having a good inventory. Holistic coverage, this is what I was referring to. We have multiple threats across the cyber supply, and this is just a snapshot across the cyber supply chain ecosystem, across software, across hardware, across services, right? Just in the software space, our developers like to reuse code, and the internet has a lot of code out there, right? And it's just the easiest way for them to get a solution to a problem that they're having, right? But these software has public software that anybody can fork, and if your developers are using the wrong piece of code, then there can be malicious code embedded into it. There are software dependencies in these codes that may have vulnerabilities that are not managed well. Then that creates an indirect exposure in your environment. The repositories themselves become compromise points. We have heard of many times NPM repositories not managed well, and then they become compromise points into the organizations, and of large organizations, not just small ones, right? Services, we have service providers who poorly configure the cloud service. So the actual cloud service infrastructure may have the greatest security out there, but if you leave the key in the door, the hackers are going to come in, right? So you may have poor technical controls implemented in the name of poor network security groups, public permissions being associated with services, etc., which create exposure points for that particular service. And you even have integration vendors. So now we've seen this also, where small integration vendors are being attacked and compromised, so that a larger organization is then using a solution that is already compromised. So these are all various, and this is just a small snapshot. This is not exhaustive. The way it is to be tried to be managed is to have a assessment life cycle across all these exposure points, right? And you usually do that with, and different companies have different strategies. We find a mix of having trusted partners and internal teams trying to manage these assessments help us do the job. There is a basic set of beliefs as well. It's a mental change led by the top. If you don't have management stakeholder buy-in, this is not going to be a very successful program. Always try to put a governance at the forefront of these changes, right? This needs to be managed through collaboration, and it is important to have all stakeholders in that conversation and they being the voice. It cannot be, again, just one security unit. It needs to be that collaborative unit. Prioritize issues for change. Again, you can't just bring a whole bunch of issues and say this needs to be done immediately, right? There needs to be a weeding out process, and that needs to be clearly communicated so that there is a roadmap for how the organization tries to get that managed. Execute. Now, a lot of organizations have a challenge with this step, and this is where there needs to be a lot of focus on getting the execution done consistently and rigorously, right? This needs to be managed well. And as I said, in your prioritization process, it's important for you to identify who's going to get this done, assign the owners, and then ensure that that execution is tracked closely. What is the suggestion for prioritizing these third parties? Again, we have a 4-way segmentation process. Select the third parties from your inventory by prioritizing them across strategic impact around uniqueness, exposure, and risk that they pose to the environment. Also try to understand the financial impact that they have, and then engage this prioritized list with your stakeholders. An influence model is important, and we have a framework that we use for that. So what are our key learnings, right? Create a source of truth, which is your inventory, right? You need to have that inventory. Engage the business lines as early as possible so that you have an understanding of your risk, right? Be pragmatic. Again, don't try to do everything the first day. Try to prioritize and create this awareness across the group of this program and this process, because that will ensure your success, right? If the more people that are engaged in this, that helps you manage, at least identify all your vendors first, and then you try to manage the risk thereafter, right? From a do perspective, ensure that you have a policy or framework, because you can then be consistent in the approach, right? You can't tell stakeholder 1, I will do 1, 2, 3, and you can't tell stakeholder 2, I will do. It creates confusion and more or less then creates a problem for you to execute. To be consistent, document, right? Too many times you'll have, you'll say something and the risk is completely different. So just document the risk. It helps your knowledge base later on as well to document the risks. Automate the assessment as much as possible, so that too many times as your vendor ecosystem you identify grows larger and larger. If you don't have a way to automate evidence collection, automate even monitoring processes, there's a lot of opportunities to make it smarter and manage it well. Otherwise, the program gets very unwieldy, right? And use trusted partners. That is our suggestion. It's a call internally to help you cover your assessment program, because they bring expertise that you may not have visibility on. And that's my time. Any questions?
Yeah, so there are a few questions. The first question is, can you share in general the layers of testing you do in order to assure that all your external assets are as secure as possible? That's the first question.
That is a large topic by itself. So yeah, we have, to summarize, right? We have an external assessment program. We have an internal assessment program. The external assessment program covers our public assets. We also have, let's say, vendors we have contracts with to ensure that we are allowed to test. So we have the ability to test their services if it's something that we consume. Then we have internal assessment programs that do split across hardware, software. So that slide that I show you, we pretty much cover that whole gamut of testing. External, internal is broken across hardware, software. We also have service delivery testing. We have our offensive security operations testing. So yes, we have a in a nutshell, we have a decently comprehensive program of testing to make sure that we try to understand our exposure.
Question is, where do you see the biggest threat area of bringing breached by malicious hacking attacks?
I didn't understand it.
Sorry, let me repeat that again. Where do you see the biggest threat areas of being breached by malicious hacking attacks?
Biggest threat areas. It is the area, for the short, simplest answer is the area which is the most poorly managed, right? And that is dependent on your ecosystem, right? So if you are a cloud based or you have large attack exposure to cloud, I would suggest that you look at all the services that you're consuming and then see if how your authentication is being managed. Are you using two-factor authentication? That's the easiest way that people now lose access to a lot of their sensitive information, their sensitive services. If you have, let's say, an IoT network that you're managing. So if you're an IoT services provider, you'll find that IoT services are not typically secured against most kinds of attacks and then can create issues for the customers you're servicing. So it literally depends on the attack surface that is poorly managed for your organization, and that needs a little bit of introspection from your end to identify that.
The last question that I have is, how do you see the threat landscape changing, and what do you see this will change in the next year?
So adoption of cloud services and this third-party ecosystem is the biggest changes that we need to manage. Everything is connected to the cloud. So it's a kind of a cop-out answer because everything is cloud. So it really depends on the cloud service that you're consuming. It can be across industries. It can be something like an IoT device being connected to the cloud, but we even have hospitals now connected to the cloud with heart pump monitors, etc., whatnot being connected, right? So adoption of cloud services, and that really requires you to do a deep dive into what are those technology endpoints and how those are being mitigated, as well as third party. So yeah, a lot of people are moving to this model of me doing what I know best, which is my business, and manage the services separately, but make sure that those service providers. So we had Vasaya very recently, the beginning of this year, a large IT services company that were managing desktops for small and medium enterprises, right? But they got locked out, and that created a problem for all those companies that were being supported by them. So those are the most prevalent threats I think we should concentrate, especially in this.
Dheeraj, once again, Mudhar Lokharmala from Al Khayat with you. What is your suggestion? Because I've been into supply chain management for many years, coming from ex-Canon environment in the Middle East and placed in Europe and all across the world, right? Now, my take, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that blockchain currently, it can really help improve the supply chain management, be it for the airlines or it could be for any industry, especially banks, etc., because it improves your traceability, it improves the coordination between your vendors, which you rightfully put, and I do appreciate a lot of stress you have been giving on the vendor involvement, not being pragmatic. That's very nice. But don't you think that blockchain could enable this faster, more cost efficiency way of going ahead with your delivery of products, helping you on the cyberspace and cybersecurity area also? What is your take in terms of, if I would say UAE Bank should go the blockchain way? Me coming from the IT department, I don't run the blockchain forum over here, but what do you think of that? Because you come from a space which is really into SCM.
Right. So, so my take, this is my personal
Your take,
right?
yes,
This
yes.
is not any bank take
Yeah.
or anything.
Caveat is your take.
Yes. So
Yeah.
blockchain is, the whole purpose of blockchain is transparency, right? It's a solution that was meant to increase transparency in whichever environment it was being utilized in, right? So if you're using currency, you can see all the transactions attached to that particular currency. If you're using it for contracts, all the particular signers and managers of it's the idea behind blockchain is to increase transparency. So now if the use case that you're stating for vendor management is to increase that transparency, then yes, blockchain is a solution that may be a criteria, right? Blockchain has its own issues. Beyond a certain point, it does not scale, becomes computationally inexpensive. So we shouldn't, again, the use case for me should be clear. We shouldn't be looking to apply a solution to a problem. We should understand the problem and then think what is the best solution for it. And that's my take on that matter.
We have one more question, that is, how do you recommend we secure testing our vendors to minimize the risk of backdoor breaches?
That's an interesting one. Yes. So yes, it depends on the model that you have, right? So you may have a model where you have the entire assessment managed end to end by the vendor, or you have vendor resources being deployed on site, right? And there are due diligence approaches for both, right? One is around how the vendor, so the vendors also typically have processes in place around background hiring, right? Like our partner Synack over here, they have one of the most exhaustive processes around looking at who they are hiring, or at least allowing people into their program, right? For select SRT clients. So it really depends on the engagement, but it is to understand their practices and procedures. Again, there isn't any, let's say, process or procedure we expect to be foolproof. So ultimately, it is what is the monitoring processes that you have at your end, right? So we have this saying in this security space: trust but validate, and that validate is continuous, and that I think is one of the most pragmatic approach. Otherwise, you'll just be paranoid and you'll not be able to do business, right? So you have to be pragmatic. Do make sure that you have good due diligence procedures. You can test these as well, and we've done some tests where we've tested those procedures to see if they are effective. If they are not, they're brought to notice. But you have to put those due diligence processes in place and then test them to make sure that your posture is understood, and then manage it thereafter.
And the last question is, with the move to the cloud, what are the inherent risks and how to best test for that?
Inherent risk. So most clouds, so the generic template, and I just told you not to use a generic template, right? So some of the most misunderstood or risks that need to be managed well in the move to the cloud is the access permissions that you are assigning. So there is an identity role and the RBAC model that will be placed for your generic services, your service users. All of that needs to first be understood by the team that is migrating to the cloud. And then those permissions need to be rigorously managed. It is very important. A small change in those permissions means unauthorized users can get access to a lot of things depending on how those service accounts are being managed. Another important thing is these cloud models are also continuously changing. So you will find one day that Azure has introduced a new service and a new set of roles and permissions have been brought to the foray, and they're set in default. Now, if that default is secure enough for you is some analysis that you need. So you cannot just configure it and forget. You need to be thinking about continuously being updated about new services that may affect your environment and how that is being managed, right? So identities and RBAC is very important. And then all the new services that get introduced, it is always good for you to analyze how these are being managed. I mean, I think these are the two big takes that immediately come to mind for me. But yeah, it's an exhaustive topic by itself.
Okay, no more questions. So thank you very much for having here. That's a great, great story, and very current in today's world, with so many attacks coming in from the back door. And it reminds me of another situation. I was about 3.5 years ago. I was in Turkey, working one of the biggest banks there, and while I was there, there was a major attack happening. And what happened is that there was a provider that was directly linked into all the major banks. They were breached. And through that breach point, they came in the back door in the banks. And some of the banks just had a lot of damage, lost a lot of money, and some banks suffered very little, and in between. But it was a real disaster because it was a provider for most of the banks there. So this is already a few years ago and not the case of this year of SolarWind and things like that. So thanks again. It's great to have Emirates NBD. Also, thank you for being a customer for Synack. And I would like to introduce now to the next speaker, another one of my favorite friends, Tawfiq Alik. Tawfiq Alik works for Emirates Airlines, one of the other major companies here in town. He is responsible for vulnerability insurance. So he covers the whole spectrum of vulnerability assessments, penetration testing, red teaming, and everything in between. And I know he works like almost all the time. And this is not an area that's very dull. And he's going to speak more about how you make some inventory, how you deal with breach points, how you deal with it, and how you handle that. And I think, in fact, he's also going to present a little bit of a unique model that might be of interest to all of you. So, Tawfiq, thank you for being here.
Sorry, can you guys hear me? Yeah, okay. So I think it's going to be a very interesting context, and I think one common message that has come across from I think both the talks that we've had so far is how do you protect things that you don't know exist, right? And I think that's where you launch into not just the IT part of it, but also the whole supply chain management and IoT and OT and all of that stuff. So I will quickly go through who I am. I look after the cybersecurity practices for assurance at Emirates Group. Everything under offensive and defensive practices is something that me and my team look after. But me personally, I'm very passionate about, so my career is like a 50-50 into offensive and defensive, right? I've spent first half of my career doing a lot of offensive practices, and then I've spent another half using these offensive practices to build defensive practices within the organization. But I think the way I look at it, I think this goes very much hand in hand. You need to be at the top of your game when you talk about offensive practices, and you use that knowledge and skill to build your defensive practices. So this is something that is, I'm very, very close. I actively speak at conferences. I'm an active member of one of the communities that was started in India, but I co-founded the chapter here. So we meet very often, talk everything under the umbrella of security. And of course, if you would like to connect on LinkedIn, that's where I am. As I said, I think the most important challenge that I think are very, very relevant from what Chris again and Dheeraj spoke as well, and I will also second to it, is you can't protect what you can't see, right? And you can't protect what you don't know. And this sort of more or less covers the summary of the topics that we've had, been spoken about this far. So I just thought, I think it was a good idea to have a disclaimer because I ran this presentation through like a bunch of people and I got like a varied feedback. And I thought it was just more important to set the context. Whatever I talk from here on is not about tools. It's not about, whether open source is good or whether commercial tools are good, right? It's not about how good or bad your inventories actually look. And I think most importantly, I'm not going to talk about the fundamentals of how asset management or inventory management is actually done. And the other thing that I need to convey as well, that when I talk about asset, I'm not talking about your IT assets alone. I'm talking about your vendors. I'm talking about the services you take. All of that bit is going to be included. So I think this picture is a very, very basic layout of how most organizations manage their inventory. Now, what do you see in this image is talking about a company called as Contoso. and it has like a bunch of domains and subdomains, right? And these in turn will have some internal representations in the form of, IP addresses and, what kind of operating systems do they run, right? And again, like I said, this is painting the picture more black and white. There is a lot more information generally into your corporate inventories where you're talking about who the owners are, who the app support people are, who the suppliers are, what kind of contracts do you have, etc., etc. But from a cyber security point of view, I think the information that is relevant in your inventories is, very, very basic, and this is what you need. I think the big problem that I have personally experienced through my process of managing an infrastructure that is as large as 10,000 servers and over 2,000 applications is a lot of these inventories actually were built for a specific purpose. What that means is that something that's in your inventory is potentially useful to people, let's say, for example, in your service management teams, or it's likely useful to people in your finance or to the HR or to your IT teams. But the bigger question is it housing data or is it storing data that is relevant to everybody, right? And I think a lot of times the answer to that question is very likely no. Let's say that if, I mean, again, I think this is, I would appreciate if any feedback from you guys as well, is when you look at your inventory and if you are somebody who's responsible for protecting your organization, would you be able to answer these questions by simply looking at your inventory alone? I'll leave the slide open, have a quick look at it and see if you can really answer these questions by simply looking at your inventory that you have as of today. For me, I think these questions largely stem from this image that I've shown, but of course, there are other questions, like this. Can you assess the impact of a particular CVE that is built for a specific version of Windows 2016 or maybe Red Hat or maybe your databases? I think this is where a lot of inventories very easily can answer you questions. But I think the important question there is, can your inventory answer questions if a particular dependency that is used inside one of the softwares that you're running had a potential 0 day in it? I am not really sure. At least I have not seen inventories that can answer questions like that. Similarly, if you are using a customized box, which is very black box in nature to you, you don't know what is going inside. And if there is a potential 0 day, how do you answer those kind of questions by simply looking at an inventory, right? And let's look at the challenges associated with it. And again, these are my personal opinions, to be honest. I'm not sure how much you can resonate to this, but I think that these are problems that a lot of people face, especially when they are tasked to protect their organizations. So these are general problems with inventory management, right? So how do you assess the impact of a CV to an org? Like if a new 0 day comes out or if a new vulnerability comes out, can you look at your inventory and very, point your finger and say that, this is something that is extremely important to me and I need to be able to address it. If you can answer that question, then you should potentially be able to answer questions like how fast I can triage the problem. Right? Let's talk about Confluence. I don't know if you guys use Confluence back in your organization, but you have an on-premise version of Confluence hosted. You will know that Atlassian has a history of vulnerabilities. And to be able to host something like in your data center is like creating a perfect backdoor. Right? I'm not trying to demean the company, but I'm just trying to say that with the amount of issues that have been identified in the recent past, it's very difficult to be able to have something like that hosted in your data center and you protecting all the other inventory as well associated in your premise. When you've identified the problem, I think the other question that you logically ask is that do you apply a patch for it? Do you apply a workaround for it? Or is this something that you can afford to live with? Now, why this is important, especially from an organization that has a massive footprint, is because if a 0 day comes out and a patch comes out, I can tell you it's practically impossible to patch your entire environment in a short span of time. Right? So even if you start triaging from, going from perimeter to inside, I think it's a big challenging task. And if you've managed to answer the first 3 questions or the first 3 problems, I think the next question do you ask is that how reliably can you make those decisions? Like even if you've completed, let's say, 1 patch cycle for a potential 0 day, can you go back and tell confidently to your senior stakeholders or execs that we are fully protected, right? And I think that's a big question mark. That's a question that I've often been asked, at least from my bosses, to say, hey, you've done this bit. Can we be certain that we will never be breached by this vulnerability? And the answer always is no, right? And we will talk about why that answer will be no. And I think the last problem that you have is that even if you've made your decision, um, it's likely that you've missed a nook or a corner. And that's largely because you don't have information of what potentially exists, and as a result, you cannot protect it. And this is a picture, seems very complicated, but I will let you absorb it for a bit. I'm not sure how visible it is, but what it essentially covers is a lot more information than the picture that you saw in the previous slide. Like in this particular inventory, what I'm potentially trying to store is not just the version of the operating system, but the build related information as well. And with the build information, I'm also storing what are the software components that are running on top of it, right? And this seems more like a mind map. And this is very important, to this particular conversation. You are not simply storing or harvesting or hoarding data that is not relevant or not useful. You are actually drawing relationships from this data. What that means is that if I were to answer questions like, how many Tomcat servers do I have that have the version 8.5.x, right? Can your inventory answer that question? Maybe yes. But if I ask you that how many of your applications that are built on Node.js, for example, use a particular version of Lodash, you may not be able to answer that question outright looking at your inventory alone, right? And I think that is what I'm going to do. I'm going to propose a framework that I think potentially can help answer these kind of questions, and they will help your teams within the organization to be more proactive in terms of staying on top of these threats that really apply to you. So what is the first proposal? For me, and for somebody like Dheeraj, three teams, right? You have the red teams, you have the blue teams, and then you have your devs, right? And all the other actors that are playing within your organization will fall into one of the other buckets. And how can these teams really help you? Recon your perimeter like a hacker would, right? What does recon mean? Recon means reconnaissance, right? If you understand a non-technical way of explaining reconnaissance is that when you go to a building to rent an apartment, you recon the area to see, whether it has a grocery store, does it have access to the hospitals, and does it have security guards, etc., etc. Right? You do basically reconnaissance of that area, and that's exactly relevant to our red team as well. When you talk about a digital world, you do a lot of reconnaissance. And this reconnaissance, you'll be amazed at the kind of information that's available about your organization on the internet, right? And it's not because you've not managed to protect, but people have become so smart at gathering information that they think is relevant to be able to go after you, whether it is from an adversarial point of view, whether it's from a bug bounty point of view, or whether it is simply your third party vendor doing an assessment about you. And there's a lot of that information that you can simply collect using recon. And this is where I think the tool disclaimer that I put comes in. I've put a lot of open source tools, right, that actually give you this information, and we will also talk about how you can stitch all of this information together. But a lot of open source tools that you can as of today use to be able to gather a lot of this information available on the internet. A good mention to the fast DNS on the project Sonar. These are companies that have historically scanned the entire internet, gathered all of that data, and made it available to people for free. So if today there is a potential 0-day on an IoT device and I want to understand how widespread the impact is, I could potentially download this data set, run some set of smart queries, and it will actually tell you how big that problem today is, right? Now, if you bring that problem down to a subset, you're talking about how can I understand the impact of my organization by looking at the data that's available on the internet. The other sources of this good information are certificate transparency logs. I'm not sure, I mean, if everyone has an understanding of what a certificate transparency logs is, but generally whenever you buy an SSL certificate from your provider, they have to make an entry into a log, which is called as a certificate transparency log. And it talks about what your subdomains are, when it was procured, when it is going to expire, all of this. The reason it is called as a transparency log is to make sure that you don't have somebody else on the internet issuing certificates on behalf of your company, right? So I think this thing picked up a lot of traction after the whole Snowden thing, where more and more visibility came out in terms of what kind of companies are issuing what kind of SSL certificates, whether they have the right to do it, whether they are authorized to do it, so on and so forth. Brute force variations for subdomains and TLDs. Brute force is a very common way today to enumerate information that is not directly available on the internet. So for example, if you go back and look up on emirates.com, maybe you will see some information available. But if somebody were to find information that is not directly available, they will resort to techniques like this to be able to say, what if I do like a variation of the word? What if I, look for common names that people spin up with? So if you saw payment.contoso.com, admin.contoso.com, these are like very common keywords. And you think, or your IT thinks that, nobody will know that there is something called as admin.contoso.com, but I bet, there are a lot of people that are far more smarter and ahead of something that you've already thought is not relevant. Of course, scanning your perimeter for known issues and doing host discoveries and service discoveries. Why this bit is very important is because this is where you will get information very, very specific to what the service or the software or the component that is running on top of your inventory. Right? And this is information that is generally missing, and as a result, you don't know. Now, if I were to summarize this slide, the thumb rule that I think is relevant is identify the data set that you need to make reliable decisions and choose the tools that will get you the data. This is very important. This is not like a data collection or a big data problem where just go and collect troves and troves and troves of data, but it doesn't add any value to the process. So identify what the problem is, see what is the decision that you would like to make, and then you figure out what tools or techniques can get you to that data, right? And again, open source tools, there are a lot of open source tools today that give you a lot of access to a lot of sensitive information that you think doesn't exist on the internet. This is another category of team in a lot of organization, blue teams. These are teams that are generally responsible for proactively identifying potential breach points and trying to look at how your defenses can be built and what kind of defenses can solve what kind of problems, etc., etc. And these are the guys who generally have access to a lot of insider information through a lot of indirect channels. So for example, if you have like a cybersecurity operation team or a SOC team that they're popularly known as, and if they collect and harvest a lot of data from different sources, like for example, firewalls or web application firewalls or reverse proxies and taps and routers and switches and etc., you will see that there is a lot of valuable information in there, right? And by simply looking at those logs, you could be actually extracting information that is very relevant for you to make a reliable decision next time when there is a potential bypass or you've identified a security misconfiguration, so on and so forth. Again, certificate transparency logs are common. The other area that I feel that is severely underlooked is your DHCP servers and your DNS servers. Now, if you are a company that manages your own authoritative name servers, you should definitely look at what your DHCP servers have for you. You should definitely look at your zone files to simply check the amount of domains that you have. Trust me, I mean, we've identified so many issues by simply looking at this. You don't need to run any tools. These are flat files that you can open literally in Notepad and check what is inside it. Identify and extract the values that are relevant to you and see whether those records exist. Do they point to third parties? If they point to third parties, are those relevant? So on and so forth. There is like a trove of information that is generally there inside the DNS zone files. Threat hunting exercises. These are very important, right? And these are fun activities that you actually do to identify threats that are relevant to your organization. And I think this is very, very important. Threat hunting is not like a generic exercise that you've gone inside a jungle to find an animal and just shoot, right? No, you are actually trying to identify those areas that you think are potentially going to be a bigger problem to you. And that includes identifying your suppliers, that include your suppliers, submitting or supplying strategic softwares where the, organization has massive investments, so on and so forth. So your threat hunting exercise technically, have like a wider coverage beyond just IT and digital risks. And of course, we've spoken about the host discovery and the service discovery. This is like a no-brainer. Anybody who runs an assurance program will always do something like this. And I think this takes me to the second thumb rule associated to the blue teams. Identify the data you need to make reliable decisions and choose the source of the data accordingly. I think the important message here is don't reinvent the wheel. I'm pretty sure that you've thought about a problem, somebody else has already thought about it, and they've created like an open source solution that you can potentially go back and leverage. So I think it's very important to understand and define your problem, and then you choose what is the source of that data, right? And then you can hopefully make reliable decisions. Next, these are very interesting set of people, right? They are your developers. These are people who write code day in, day out, and the job is to be able to ship code as fast as possible. And when I say as fast as possible, with the advent to cloud and with moving to the cloud, they are even more faster than they were, back in the day. And what that only means is that when you start creating processes and governances and frameworks around how you should be going live, what kind of code versionings you should do, you are very likely overwhelming them with your problems, right? Why do you want them to solve your problems? And an easier way to address or countermeasure this is, if you look at companies like Netflix, if you look at companies like Facebook, Google, what they do is that they don't overwhelm their developers for solving security problems. What they do is they've created a lot of parallel processes that run in the background that add immense value in terms of identification of potential vulnerabilities within their software itself, right? And a very good example of this today is, if you are a company that has infrastructure in cloud, and if you do infrastructure as code, you're very likely spinning up a lot of cloud resources through code itself. So there is no human involved that says that, 5 people have to approve before a server will sort of be provisioned and given to you. It's just infrastructure as code. And if it's scalable, you're very likely, spinning up workloads dynamically up and down. And these instances could go up, but they could also have a domino effect on your inventory. I like to call them as that they will send your inventories to down, right? Because you will have so many things running into your cloud that you potentially don't know. The other area that, I want to introduce everyone to is something called as generation of software bill of material. I don't know how many people understand, but I'm more than happy to, walk you through the slide after this one. But what this essentially means is that when you've written a certain piece of software, I'm pretty sure that you don't write it from the scratch. What you do is that you combine a lot of open source software, third-party components and libraries that have already been written by different authors on the internet, and you piece them together to be able to deliver your code, right? And these are inventories, or these are dependencies, if you like to call them, or you like to call them as NPMs in the world of Node.js, etc., very important to a successful delivery of a project, right? And lastly, software composition analysis. Now, this is a very interesting process where you take all the dependencies that are used within your code and you identify what are the potential weaknesses in those libraries directly. So while you may be shipping very good code, but that doesn't mean that the third-party components that you use were also designed and developed with the same kind of due diligence, right? And that process of identifying vulnerabilities in dependencies or in code that doesn't belong to you is basically called as software composition analysis. And I think the bigger question, and I think this is where I want to be able to spend some time on. Sorry, before I get there, let's talk about, what an industry standard definition of software bill of material is, right? Again, it's basically modern software that is assembled using third-party and open source components glued together in a complex and unique way and integrated with original code to provide desired functionality. This is exactly what I said, right? So it's your code, then there are a lot of other dependencies on it. You've pieced them together in the way that works for you. And as a result, you've delivered a product or a feature or a story. Automated generation of third-party libraries or open source components used in your code. And this is, I think, what Dheeraj's entire talk was based on: supply chain attacks. If you actually look at the paradigm shift in the way supply chain attacks work, these are not new at all. They've existed for years in different shapes and forms, but today they become more and more relevant is because a lot of companies use a lot of open source softwares and libraries, and a lot of their authors have made their sources open code. So if you go to places like, Bitbucket, or if you go to GitHub, you will find a lot of this code that is available. Somebody can simply review the code. It's not as easy I'm making it sound, but of course, there are tools and techniques that people identify issues and then they actually go and report these issues in a similar way. So I'm not sure if you guys have heard the recent problem with an attack, a class of vulnerability called as dependency confusion attack. It's very simple. What all it does is that it goes and identifies all the dependencies that you have within your code. And then when you try to fetch them from the author's repository, it's likely that that particular library was not registered in an intended way. What that means is that now I could potentially register that on a website like npmjs.org. And then now when your build systems actually start pulling the code, they are pulling the code that I wrote and not the original authors. Right now, imagine if your organization created a custom library and never registered them into a public repository or a package manager. It's very likely that your organization is vulnerable to something like this. Now, it's not, all of this that I'm talking is not relevant to you alone. I think it's also very, very relevant to your vendors that are very, strategic partners in terms of delivering, the software to you. So whatever that we've spoken so far, you should also be having these conversations with your vendors, right? And I think it's very important that you have these conversations with your vendors. If you've created a tooling or a framework or tool sets, there is no harm in sharing these tool sets with your vendors to tell you, hey, you're going to supply me a black box, but that's totally okay. Can you run a dependency checker and tell me all the third-party components that you use within your software? And that information is relevant because whenever the next CV or the 0-day comes out, you will be able to go back to your vendor proactively and say, hey, your tool uses this particular dependency. Can you please tell us by when do you patch it, right? And then you start applying workarounds or whatever it is accordingly. And I think the last bit is very, very important. Again, this is not a data collection activity. You gather all of this data and what I call them as build relationships between your data set, right? What that means is that you take a particular domain, you should be able to map how many IP addresses does it have, what kind of technology stacks run on it, what versions do they have, and then what kind of dependencies are present on those software that you're running as well, which is very, very important. And once you've built something of that sort is when you will be able to answer a lot of interesting questions. And this is the slide that puts everything that I've been talking about together. So your red teams have contributed to data, your blue teams have contribution to the data, your development teams have contribution to the data set. And then you as a function for assurance or function for cybersecurity within your team, what do? You choose a repository which will house all of this data, right? In most cases, it is the same inventory management system that is used within your organization. I had a very interesting conversation with a lot of my colleagues to understand, should this be sitting in the enterprise inventory or should this be sitting somewhere in a security repository because only security teams find this data to be relevant. And after a lot of back and forth, we realized that this data was not just useful for us. This data was useful to a lot of other teams. So we then started talking to individual teams to identify how much of value do you see in the data that you store inside the inventory. And our answer to a lot of these conversations were that if I had these 5 additional fields in my inventory, this would be like, the single source of truth for me. Finance has a different answer, HR has a different answer, IT has a different answer, and cybersecurity has a different answer. What that essentially means is that the team that basically sets up inventory and then runs it is not necessarily obligated to put the data that is not relevant to them. Because if they are the owners for the platform, they likely have to hold it and manage it as well, right? So I think it's very important when you have these conversations with your different teams, you realize that there is a lot of information in inventory which you could simply ingest that will make the inventory far more powerful in terms of making reliable decisions, especially from a cybersecurity point of view, right? Now, of course, you would ask questions on, yes, but you're saying that this is not a data collection activity, but how do I gather all of this data? And I think a simple answer to that question is automation, right? If you pick a tool, create an automated pipeline for it, that pipeline is only going to get you one piece of information that is useful to you. And then you have multiple pipelines that run multiple tools to be able to get multiple information, right? And this is again another big enterprise problem where, from a cost point of view, from an efficiency point of view, we like to buy one tool that answers all the questions, right? And in the process, you then start making compromises that, okay, if I don't get this information, it's fine. But, I would still be able to get like enterprise support around it. I will have feature rich, enterprise tools, etc., etc. But if you start looking at it from a different lens, then you will realize that you don't have to buy one tool that does everything for you. You could technically have multiple tools that are running in parallel in the background without even bothering like a single minute of your developer or your IT teams or anybody else that is getting all of this data and ingesting into one place. Of course, choosing standardized formats helps you because then if you use expensive inventory management software, they will give APIs, and these APIs will have the ability for you to ingest all of this data that you've collected. Define relationships between assets and data sets is very important. As I said, all the way from looking at a domain, if you can really map all the possible areas where that domain has a presence in your environment, you will be able to kill your vulnerabilities or your problems at a much faster pace than you would without that information. Identify and eliminate false positive. Of course, I mean, every time when you talk about automation, there is a scope for false positives. You identify and eliminate these false positives, which means you improvise your tooling over a period of time. And the last bit is rinse and repeat. if you have a newer problem to solve, and if you need a data set, you repeat the entire process, going through different teams within your organization to understand what kind of tooling is required and how can you gather that piece of information and build the relationships between them. Well, I think that's pretty much the summary of what I wanted to share. I hope it was useful, but yes, I'm open to any questions that anybody has.
Okay, there are a few questions.
Sure.
Okay. The first one is, what kind of attacks that you see the most in Emirates Airlines, and do you see any trends?
Well, that's a very direct question, no? Why would I tell you what are the attacks that are relevant? But anyways, I think airline industry in general, right? I compare them often with a lot of companies that have been running industrial systems for a very, very long time. If you are somebody who's passionate about technology and see the amount of technology that is used to be able to achieve a certain business goal is astounding. Like you will find IoT devices, you will find OT devices, you will find non-conventional black boxes connected to your environment. So I think the attack surface is massive in general to the industry itself. And if the attack surface is massive, then of course, I think Chris and Dheeraj have spoken about a lot of things that you could potentially do and look for to be able to understand the attack surface.
Okay. The next question is, can you say anything about the levels of testing that you do in support of SDLC or develop to go live and ongoing updates?
Yes, I think there is, again, I think it's very unique to each organization. But at a very high level, I think something that should ideally work for most of us is to have the ability to shift a lot of your identification processes to the left, right? Generally, when you go for a build or for a release, is when your security teams generally engage and they identify issues, and then you suddenly become like the blocker of all good things. But you should find ways and means to be able to shift all of these identification processes to the left. The more you shift them to the left, I'm not saying they should be to the extreme left, but the more you shift closer towards the left, the less expensive is your development lifecycle. Because when a bug is identified towards the tail end of the process, you have to undergo a lot of other gate checks to be able to reproduce, your problems. So identifying, what matters to you, what kind of issues matter to you, and having the right tooling and moving it to the left is, I think, an ideal or a recommended way of doing different gate checks. And of course, I think in addition to this, once a product goes live, doesn't mean that's the end of the day or life for you. Of course, then you have a lot of companies that you can engage. Like, for example, you have Synack, HackerOne, Bakrad. A lot of these companies, they do a lot of active testing of your code in production. And I think they bring a lot of fresh insight into the kind of problems that are there in your production, which your internal teams may not necessarily have, the leisure to identify. So I think having that third eye is also very important, where you're doing everything right within your organization to see, to ship as less bugs as possible. Come on, I mean, nobody likes to ship bugs in production. But, if we do it, not advertently or inadvertently, it just happens because that's how, life is. So then you engage somebody who looks after these problems at the tail end of the process and reports these vulnerabilities to you creatively. Once they're identified, rather than trying to do a point fix, you try to kill the class of the vulnerability itself. So for example, you've identified a black and white example, a SQL injection. You don't want to fix that endpoint. You want to rather go back in your code and see all the potential SQL injections and fix the whole class of the problem itself, right? And that's how you become more and more mature in terms of your overall defensive posture. Sure.
I'm not a better judge, but you did a very good presentation, Tawfiq.
you so
Very
much.
nice. Thanks again.
Thanks.
Muzar with you once again from Al Khayat. You talked about assets and data sets. I want your simple one-line take on data assets.
I mean, I think it again depends from organization to organization. Like everything that is valuable to your organization, for me, is a data set. So for example, if you're talking about an inventory of all the suppliers that you have and their respective master service agreements or third-party agreements, etc., if that is relevant to your business, if that's relevant to your organization, that's a data set for you. So
Would you also let me redefine it as a data asset is a subset of data sets because it dynamically stores metadata. if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, absolutely.
About every single aspect of what you very nicely explained in terms of suppliers, inventorization, going into subsets of drilling it down further in the next slide. I couldn't see much because I've got an eye problem right now, but
No, but
but
share
it
the
was very
presentations.
it was
Yeah.
very small also. It was
Yeah.
very, very small. But I would request you to share
Yes,
that
for
slide,
sure.
right?
Yes.
But would you not allow me to redefine it as saying that data asset is a subset of many data sets?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, definitely. I don't think there is anything called as right and wrong when it comes to defining a data set, right? I think whatever works for you is very important. As long as the problem statement is very clear to you and you know what are the data points that you need to be able to solve that problem statement that you've defined, becomes a data set for you, right? And you don't, again, like I said, it doesn't have to be necessarily complex. It can be something as simple as saying that if I knew the version details of all my build systems within the organization, I could potentially answer questions whenever there is a potential, 0 day. Like for example, you have people use Jenkins very commonly, but a similar CI/CD tool is also Travis, and Travis runs in the cloud. And I think there's an ongoing conversation on the internet about a potential weakness in the Travis. If you had that information with you, you would be able to quickly assess how fast you can solve the problem or even make that decision, to be honest.
And would you like to have a backup of these data sets in a static environment? Because it's always a dynamic way of approach.
Yes.
Right now, the landscape is changing drastically dynamically, if I can use the 2Ds myself.
Yeah. Well, I think this is a conversation that I've had with my peers and colleagues at work as well, right? That there is no value in collecting a data that is static. Let me talk about a very traditional approach to asset management. I want a new server. I raise a request to some of my IT teams. They provision that server. I gather all the information and give it to them. But after, let's say, 5 or 6 patch cycles, it's very likely that the operating system version itself has changed. It's very likely that I'm not running the same software that I used to run back in the day anymore on it. Now, if that data was not updated, it has very little value. I'm not saying that there is zero value. I'm saying that there is very little value because you cannot take that data and rely and make a security decision with it. So what you do is that you create automated tooling that will keep that data up to date. Because honestly, nobody likes to go back and update inventories. It's like a very laborious activity, especially if you managing an asset inventory that goes upwards of 10,000 assets within your organization.
And especially it's relevant to banks and airline industries because you have so much loads and loads of data that if you're not up to speed on asset management and inventorization, you are really lost when a cyber attack happens.
Absolutely. And that's why I
Completely
said,
lost.
I think the challenge, and that's how I, started the presentation by saying that you cannot protect things that you don't know exist. It's as simple as that, right? And you will be in that state for a very, very long time. But what that means is that your maturity levels will change over a period of time. So today you don't know certain things. Tomorrow you will start knowing more of it. And that more of it will lead to, or more subsequent events that will eventually force you to gather all of these data points at a period of time. But when you attain a certain level of maturity and when you look back at your data sets, you will see how valuable that information is to you.
Yeah. Thanks. Though.
Okay, so we have one more question that is, what recommendations would you have for companies and government departments that rely on core web and website and mobile apps for their business and keeping them secure, keeping things secure?
Well, I think there's no one thing you can do, right? There are a lot of things that you can do, right? And as I said, you start by identification. Let me use a more industry standard term, like you define what is called as a threat model, right? When you've picked up a certain application or a mobile application, or when you decide to develop it, I think you should very well understand what the threat model is. It's a very interesting exercise that you do with your architects and your development teams to identify potential, threats into the design itself. And threat models happen not after the code is written. It generally happens even before the first line of code is written, right? So I think you start from that point of view, and then you build different guardrails and checks within your toolings or the automated CI/CD pipelines to identify a certain classes of problem that are completely unacceptable to you from a risk tolerance point of view. So for example, detection of secrets, right? You don't want ever your AWS or Azure secrets to be there into the code repository, right? And there are people who actively look for these kind of secrets in public repositories, and you don't want to be in that shape. So if you've integrated a tool into your pipeline that automatically disallows any pull request to even be committed when they see a secret is a very good value add. So it depends on what things are important to you, identify the right tools, integrate them into the pipeline itself. So when a developer does a pull request, you've already done a certain sanity check even before the code was accepted. And that's what the whole process of shift to the left does. And then, once you've moved, as you start moving towards the right, you start doing a lot of continuous assessments to identify potential problem in your code. And finally, once you go live, I think your monitoring is very important. Your CSOC, your cybersecurity operations, your blue teams are very, very important in terms of telling you what is going on in the perimeter. This is simply because identifying vulnerabilities is a very creative process. So there is no fixed way of saying that there is, if you follow step 1, 2, 3, and 4, you will be able to identify SQL injection. It doesn't work like that. It's a very creative process and different people have different takes on it. So I think once you've done things at the beginning, during the development, and finally when the code goes live, you do have a fresh pair of eyes that is looking at what kind of vulnerabilities are shipping into your production environments as well. And I think it's a combination of these three that are very important and relevant to any organization, whether it is government, non-government, private entities. I think, and then finally it boils down to how comprehensive your coverage is, right? And that sort of helps you understand your security posture the best.
There's the last question, and that is, how does the Emirates Group gauge, manage, and mitigate the security risks that their supply chain and suppliers?
Well, again, it's a very pointed question, but to very simply answer that, everything that Dheeraj has said, right? Or maybe a little less, or maybe a little variation of whatever he said. Again, this is not something that is very unique to an organization. This is a real world problem. And I'm sure that third-party supply chain risks or issues have been identified and solved in the past, but they were solved for a different domain. So like, for example, you have, finance and, HR dealing with them in a different way. Your audit dealing them in a different way. So I would second everything that, Dheeraj has spoken so far is very, very important. It's very important to keep your vendors close to you because you know what's going on, in this world. That's it. Okay. Well, thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Tawfiq. Thank you for being a speaker and all the technical insights. And I know you're on the leading edge of things you can take on. So thank you very much. It's great to also have you, and I know we're also doing some things with your organization. Then I have the opportunity as a last speaker, and by the way, there's no breaks because it's a live broadcast. So whenever you had to stop or whatever, you have done or can do so. The last speaker I would love to introduce to you is Thomas Hornung. Thomas Hornung is a senior solution architect from Synack. Been there for a couple of years, 2 years or so, but his history is a very long one, from I think like 30 years in IT and 15 or years longer in security. And what he's doing, is he transforming, we saw the story from Chris talking about all the threats that are at us. We saw how Dheeraj was talking about how the Emirates NBD Bank, how to deal with these backdoor challenges. You hear Tawfiq he covers the full spectrum of red teaming, pen tests, and all of that in terms of methodologies and approaches and ways of how he's trying to manage that in the most possible secure way. So Thomas, as the last speaker for today, will take it forward and say, okay, here is also an approach you can take in a more offensive testing perspective in terms of how you can mimic more of this kind of attack behavior that comes at you all day long, every day, and continues to be more sophisticated and growing exponentially. And how would you do that? Because what it also shows is that the traditional way of doing things no longer apply in today's world. It's going too fast. The groups that the nation state sponsored stuff that Chris spoke about, as well as malicious commercial hacking groups, they're just moving too fast, they're too sophisticated. So it's really hard to keep up with that. So what is a way to do this? And that, I think, is what Thomas is going to present, or maybe demo, I'm not sure. So Thomas, thank you for being with us this morning from, I believe, Luxembourg. Thank you.
Yes, correct. Thank you very much, Ron. And good morning to everyone in the room virtually. And as Ron said, so the topic is mimicking sophisticated attack behavior with an offensive security testing platform. So actually, those are many topics that have been discussed already in the 3 previous sessions, but with a focus specifically around some areas where ethical hackers are actually very valuable. Now, before getting into that, I just want to set the scene. So everyone is totally familiar about these information. So we have threats. So there are lots of threats constantly. Threat actors, as Chris mentioned, as Dheeraj mentioned, as Tufik mentioned, motivation. So the thing is, this is what we are facing on a daily basis, the professionals in IT security. Now, some figures I've just taken out, which are just so scary. For example, Imperva released, for example, a quarter of the worldwide traffic is malicious. And so actually they did a little bit of research, and so bad bots traffic, so 25%, that's scary. Since the pandemic started, for example, we are close to 700% increase in phishing attacks that have been noticed. And another one, which really triggered with me something, wow, this is enormous. Predictions for this year in cyber crime cost, we're looking at $6 trillion. 6 trillion. And there is an increase yearly of 15%, so reaching 10 trillion by 2025. It's just enormous. And actually, just out of interest, where we are currently with regard to cybersecurity spendings. So 123 billions last year have been spent on cybersecurity. Whoa, okay. Next thing, I just wanted to get into this one here. Just to represent, you're all familiar with these live threat maps. So whether it's Bitdefender, Cyber, Checkpoint, or anyone else. So this is where you can see in real time malware attacks, any other security incident which has been monitored and collected by different sources. Isn't this scary? On the other side, are we well prepared? So now specifically looking at penetration testing to stand up against this battle. So there is a constant threat out there, which is growing. And we are very often looking at securing us. And so through penetration testing or other types of security audits, which are compliance driven, which are done by small and static teams, sometimes 1 or 2 pen testers, 2 laptops, 2 weeks, point in time. So do it once a time, I added here, or maybe more, maybe it's quarterly. But actually, that's what we are seeing most of the time. And also no visibility. You don't know what they have been testing. And also the reports, a 500-pager document that you will get at the end of the exercise. Now, one question. Do you think this is a fair game that we are playing here, that we are participating? And actually, I found this picture here quite, worrisome. So we have our opponents, which are growing and growing, resources and also capabilities and patience. So the thing is, this is what we are facing. So. And what we are doing is we try our best. And I think some companies are doing better than others, but it is like an enormous task that we are up against. Because also what we are looking for, we are looking from a compliance exercise perspective. So we are planning our security very often being that the opponents are tool-centric, process-oriented, static, and fixed. So that means same as we are. So we have checklists, we do that, we do that, we do that. So actually we are planning then as well that the bad guys which are out there after our assets, that they are following such a process. But actually they are not. They are creative, diverse, persistent, evolving, adaptive, and many more. So they have time, they have resources, and they have huge networks. And the thing is, they're approaching also the good guys like Chris to collaborate with them. So that's actually what we are looking at. Now, Let me now jump into, imagine a security testing platform, which allows you to embrace that offensive, incentivized crowd of ethical hackers using a combination with machine intelligence around a platform, giving you actionable result. And that's actually what Synack crowdsourced security platform is able to deliver you. So actually we're changing from compliance driven to vulnerability driven. So that means our researchers, ethical hackers that are part of the Synack Red team, they get incentivized based on findings. Offensive scalable teams. So we are no longer looking at small teams, 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 people that are going after the assets. It is typically between 30, 40, 50, 60, and if needed, we can even add more into it to get that flexible approach and that scalable teams element into the equation, combining with machine intelligence. And so have really both elements collaborating together for getting a full coverage out of it. On the point in time, so very often we're speaking with clients that are telling us we would like to get into a more regular testing, like monthly eventually or continuous, but a traditional pen testing element is not fit for that purpose. And here we can deliver that continuous capability. And last but not least, through a platform that Synack is built around, there is a client portal giving you real-time insights into the coverage on web applications, into vulnerabilities, to reproduce these as they have been accepted, and go through the penetration testing results, which is around patch verification. So the ultimate validation that your mitigation strategies have actually worked. Some other key capabilities that I wanted to highlight, which are obvious, like flexibility, on demand, continuous, also microtest. We see more and more the demand by the developers saying, I do not want a full test, I just want this function to be tested by 3 guys by tomorrow morning, for example. Speed and breadth. So I like the term always on, not for availability, but actually, yes. So always on security testing team. So do you have your resources waiting there that something needs to be tested? I hope not. I hope that they are busy, but the problem is that they are oftentimes too busy to actually do the things on the testing side. So with a speed and breadth of 1,500 highly vetted researchers, this is how we are able to complement our clients' security teams. On the talent side, yeah, so finding good resources is a challenge nowadays. So the figures, I don't know what are actually the missing security professionals nowadays, but we're talking about millions. So it is not something that you find on each corner, and it's quite difficult to address. And on the noise side, so Tufik mentioned that bringing to the developers non-actionable information is a killer, is a no-go for most of our clients, and we have learned that. So what we are after is really learn what the client appreciates in the findings. So typically a report comes in, Synack triages it, sends it to the client. If we see a client says not valid, we try to understand and improve our quality submissions, so the quality levels for acceptance. And we are working together with them because it's all about noise reduction because in these busy times. Last but not least, integrations. So integrations of vulnerability data is key as well, like ServiceNow, Splunk, Sentinel is on the roadmap, Jira, and many others. Now, on topic of who are these ethical hackers, which are constituting the Synack Red team. So these researchers actually span 82 nationalities, countries where they originate from. And so having 82 countries, whereas, for example, traditionally you're working with local vendors, penetration testing vendors, they have always the same mindset. So we can also limit, for example, our researchers to just one region like EMEA, but we highly recommend leaving it open to have that breadth of different approaches, mentalities, and tactics. So when addressing a target. And these researchers now, they are assisted by machine intelligence. And what we are doing is we are taking that element of bug bounty platforms to incentivize the researchers based on valid findings. But we are clearly in between that space of traditional pen testing, which is controlled trust, and bug bounty, which is quite loose with vulnerability disclosure programs. Because what we are doing is, of all the applicants that you see on the left side, we are going through a strict vetting process, which takes between 3 and 9 months, depending on the speed of responses. And there is skills assessment, theoretical, practical, interviews, behavioral checks, ID and background checks, criminal record checks. And once they are onboarded, there is that coaching and that monitoring for the new joiners to tell them how to write reports, what to do and what not to do, prohibited activities, what is stop and report, and what about denial of service, what is acceptable. And then monitoring as well. So as they continue working with us, we constantly have an eye on their activity. I'm showing you in the next slide what that looks like. And with the 1,500 researchers, that's the active core. Because we are off-board, researchers that don't comply, don't behave well, or become inactive. Because nothing worse than having stale, records in your database. It's about cleaning this up. And so this is really our core number of researchers that you see at the resulting right side. Now, here's just a screenshot. And so if time allows, I'm going to go into the demo portal as well. If you are interested, we can also have a follow-up session. But this is the client portal. So you as a client get access to that information of penetration testing. So it's a collaborative platform for the researchers on one hand, and also for the clients to look at the results as they come in with metrics. Like, for example, I got this web application, and for example, I see 60% of the findings in that web application were around authentication and session management. So that's good intel, actually also correlating with what Tufik said, to do some root cause analysis. Rather than, doing some band-aids here and there, look at it holistically and say, okay, let's move to our new B2C, for example, IAM database, and not park it until next year. So prioritize where to look first. And from a high-level architecture view, so you see Synack Red Team and SmartScan. So those are human intelligence and machine intelligence, which are working hand in hand together. But the main focus is around the Synack Red Team. So the Synack Red Team will be invited based on their skills to a target, and they will start testing unstructured discovery of exploitable vulnerabilities. That's really what is key. It is really that offensive mentality, that adversarial approach that is being put into the benefit of our clients, and they will start testing. And Launchpoint there in the middle actually captures all of the traffic that the researchers are sending to the targets. With the targets being whether it's clouds, whether it's on-prem or internal environments, web host, mobile, those are the standard targets that we are addressing. And there is another slide, which is also very interesting to tie again into Tufik's recommendation of that shift left that I'm going to address as well. So currently we are testing 60% in production environments. But there is clearly a tendency since I joined Synack 2 years ago that we are moving more and more on the left side. So testing earlier on. Now, with regard to the findings that researchers are submitting, they will be completed and validated by the Synack operations, which are Synack employees validating, looking at these for reproducibility, quality, whether it's clearly documented, whether all the elements are included in the write-up, and sending it back for editing or rejecting these. And the ones that they are accepting will be published into the client portal. That means if we're starting a test, for example, today, we will get reports tomorrow. The client sees the SQLi report and can immediately start remediating by having access via the client portal. Now, here are some sample results that we took. For example, before testing, starting a test on an application, we looked at scanner results. So, you know, scanner looking for known vulnerabilities have their limits, as everyone knows clearly. This is what the scanner has shown. After our Synack Red Team testing, those are the findings that have been reported and accepted and presented to the client, which is worrisome. Now, typically, not very often clients actually go with some new development, new application, public before a penetration test has actually happened or a red team exercise. So, but for that example, I have another slide, which is we very often get benchmarked, compared to their traditional penetration testing activity. And actually, this is a result. It was in Asia, in the financial sector. And we were not aware that there was a penetration testing that had been completed. We were brought in, we were doing our regular stuff. And actually afterwards, they told us, hey, actually, we just completed penetration test by our traditional vendor, which was a large consulting firm. And those are the findings that we are bringing to the table. So it's about the crowd, the power of the crowd, and the creativity of the ethical hackers, like Chris, like many others around the world. And also not limited to just one region. So really use the full breadth. South America, North America, EMEA, Middle East, Asia. That's actually what the strength is about. And this slide, actually, I had it taken out, but I just thought about putting it in. And I see it myself in so many cases. An insurance in Spain, for example, they are struggling with the remediation in production that we have brought to their attention. And actually, the developers, they are now looking into implementing a framework change to the application to mitigate all of the findings in that certain category. But playing around in production, have the researchers validate and guide them and help them in a patch verification process is not so easy. So actually, we are now in the discussion of shifting left. So shifting left, that we can really collaborate and be a trusted advisor with our Synack Red Team to the development teams and assist them. And here it is also clearly the cost, not only breach and other things related, but also the remediation efforts in pre-production or UAT environments are clearly less costly. Now, some more slides that I'm going to briefly skip over, some case studies. So Domino's, for example, which is pizza, yeah, but IT is so huge within Domino's. So online bookings, so reservations, it's about the drivers, it's about the shops, it's about the ERP, logistics, so it's a huge element. And they are long-time customers with us, and they have fully integrated Synack into the SDLC process to test as early as possible. Other examples, for example, in the aerospace and defense, so GDIT, we're partnering with. So those are the types of engagements that we are seeing, or Santander is 100% in production that we are testing, so nothing in UAT and pre-production. And last but not least, Department of Defense, we are testing in here, for example, everything which is, let's say, not so obvious for the bug bounty platforms actually to test. So those are actually some of our main targets and partners, reference clients that I'm allowed to name. With regard to this one here, let me play it once more. That's actually what we are facing. And I think what Dheeraj and Tufik mentioned, all great things. And I think from a maturity perspective, you're doing a huge job, but just see at what we are facing on a daily basis and try to use these ethical hackers and don't see them as a threat. And maybe also what Chris mentioned on the managed responsible disclosure or VDP program. So just on the side note, we can even spin that up for you if you don't have one available. So that's actually me done. Any questions?
Yeah, hi Tom. We have a few questions. The first question is, can you share more insight in how you vet your researchers and logic behind deploying them in large teams?
Yeah. So actually, the vetting process is nowadays become more effective in a way that, let's say 3 years ago, we just discarded 88% of the applicants via our portal. We just, discarded them because trust wasn't there, skills were not there, etc. So that wasn't a very effective process. So nowadays, what we are doing, we are more and more partnering up with our clients. We got many of our clients that have their pen testers participating in the Synack Red Team, for example. And other things as well, Hack the Box. We are sponsoring Hack the Box. We got lab over there to get that initial validation, whether they have the skills required. And very often it's about, recruiting via these channels, and like also researchers speaking at universities and on board and make publicity for the Synack Red Team. Now, with regard to the control of this crowd, so I always emphasize on the fact we have only, I'm saying only 1,600 researchers, and we don't make a publicity. We have 300,000, we have 500,000, we have 1 million. How can you manage possibly 1 million researchers, ethical hackers? So I think it's impossible. So what we are focusing on, these 1,600, as Synack is liable for the activity, we are putting so much effort in validating that these are trustworthy ethical hackers to the best degree we can. And when we are working with the researchers, we have that confidence and we are inviting them. But also the control with regard to launch points. So the full packet capturing is also allowing us to trace back, for example, any activity. The client blue team tells us, hey, there's been this activity going on, but this is out of scope. Why is that happening? And actually, we are starting an incident investigation and we are checking with a researcher, with the ethical hacker, what have you been doing? And this is actually what we are bringing to the table with regard to trust.
The next question is, how do you compare the use of automated vulnerability assessments versus scanning versus what Synack does?
Very good question. And I think Chris is going to agree with me. The machine is not taking over yet, at least, and especially not the penetration testing environment. So I'm not sure in 10 years, the 10x is always something. We are looking at that. We are seeing the advancement being done there. But from last year findings across all our testing activity that we have been doing, we saw that 93% of the findings are uniquely tailored vulnerabilities found by our researchers, by the human creativity. Now, if we're looking at things like automated pen testing solutions, so which go a little bit further than a Qualys, for example, but still the breadth of coverage from these tools, we are not looking at a true AI yet, and so I think we have to wait another 10 years. So it is really unique findings, 97% last year.
Okay, the next question is, we hear about bug bounty, but find that to lose and see multi-risk and challenges with the model. In what way are you different?
So in a way, we are different, especially on the bug bounty side, it is very loose and uncontrolled. Whereas with Synack, we are putting much more control around the testing activity. So having a smaller crowd, you don't have huge competition between the researchers. And so it's more collaborative. On the other side is we don't we are paying out bounties, but we do not commingle finance with security. So there is a fixed cost model that we are operating with, which is totally a game changer when it comes to this aspect, because our vulnerability operations team, they are validating the reports, all of them that are coming in, and if they are valid, they will be handed over. So there's no competition with, oh, the wallet is empty or it's almost empty, I need to do something about it. So no bad publicity here, but our VulNops is really looking at the reports and accepting them. So that's why they are looking at them. But it's a duplicate, they are not going to accept it, obviously. If it is low impact, we are not accepting low impact findings. So anything which is of a severity, of an impact, and which is severe enough to bring to the client's attention will be accepted. If the client says, I do not agree, no worries as well, because we have taken this decision to accept that finding. The researcher is paid within 24 hours. So there's no risk associated with making grumpy ethical hackers, because grumpy ethical hackers who got a SQLi report rejected because the client says, this is not important for us, there is no problem related to that. So that's why our model differs in nuances which are so important from a security perspective. And another thing is as well, we don't have competition between programs. So no competition between researchers, because there are 50 researchers on one target at any given time. So a researcher is willingly invest 4 hours, 5 hours, 10 hours, 20 hours, because he sees this route is well rewarded, because I'm not competing potentially with 20,000 ethical hackers out there. And the other thing is we do not offer any kind of competition between programs. All programs with their code work are equally rewarded based on market value.
Great. I think the next question is already answered. So, okay, then there's another question. Can you share some statistics on your track record, such as how many researchers on each project and hours of testing, and how many vulnerabilities you typically find?
That's a very good question, actually, in a sense that it is our duty, or Synack's work behind the scenes is manage the crowd and to deliver full coverage, to deliver value to the client, to help reduce risk. This is what we are working, because actually the main active part are the researchers and the ethical hackers part of the Synack Red. So what we are doing is we are looking at, for example, the scope. I do scoping, and if a client asks me to test something, I'm sometimes pushing back and saying that doesn't make sense. You want me to test Office 365? First of all, we're not allowed. Secondly, what do you want to get out of it? And so actually we are looking at the testing that we are handing over to the researcher can yield good results. Or if someone comes with a list of brochureware sites, I'm saying, are you sure? Can't we add something into it? Or black box, hey, can't we get credentials? And so this is actually the conversation that we have, that we have a scope defined, which is going to be beneficial from a results perspective. And then the researchers, if they are getting onto the target, they will start testing, and we will drive the activity, because we will see through the launch point full packet capturing, we see the number of active researchers. And if we see for certain things, it was a cryptocurrency platform that we saw, customers since 4 years now in the region, very hardened attack surface. So we saw that the hours were a little bit weak, and the number of researchers. So what we are doing is we add more researchers to it. what we are doing is, okay, this is very hardened, the retest last year, so all the findings have been remediated. So let's give some additional incentives. And so any findings, CDSS 5 and higher, get an additional reward. So that's actually what Synack does, really the managing and the coaching of the researchers to get the activity. But typically what we are seeing is 50 active researchers on a web target and a minimum of 300 hours. But in reality, it also tends to be double in number of hours, to be fair. And the number of findings, this is also a very good one. There, I got another airline. So it's not Emirates Airline, but it's a European airline. We tested the whole portal, and we had 50 exploitable vulnerabilities, of which 10 critical ones. So on the retest now, it looks much better, of course, but those are, let's say, the upper edge number of findings that we are finding in a test. The lower part was a very interesting example. It was testing identity IQ before going live, with and without credentials, multiple roles. We only had 2 findings, and one was within identity IQ, and the other one was a WAF bypass. But the client was, hey, brilliant, because if we would have gone out with that configuration, we would have a big problem. And another example I just want to highlight, a continuous testing of an e-commerce platform for designer clothing. We found, what was it? I think it was just an IDOR, which was allowing the researcher to get to all customer-related information that were stored in the backend. And they said, hey, this is amazing. So only this finding already has done its return on investment of the investment we did for the test we were doing with you guys. So it is really, no hard number actually to show on the number of findings.
Thank you. There's a question, one second.
Yeah.
One last question out of the audience.
Sorry, you guys must be tired of me already. Mudar once again from Al Hayat Thomas. I just would like to draw your reference on the fair game slide. That was a very nice slide. That's my personal take. And I felt the smaller part of the bigger picture, right?
Yeah.
One of your slides also mentioned about traditional pen testing, right?
Yeah.
Which says that you really needed to stand up against the opponents.
Yeah.
Now, that's a very nice reference I would draw, because for me, TPT is an important part of cybersecurity. It identifies weaknesses, if I'm not mistaken, also provides me with reports. But for me, the cons of doing a TPT is I am supposed to trust my pen test partner. Okay. The other thing is, do we really do realistic testings? Are we really having an attack coming in my environment? Then why do I need a pen testing? I'm talking about pros and cons. These are my takes, and I have drawn references in my mind for this. But I need to take your take on this one. How do Synack approach this? For example, reports could be misleading if it's not a reality, real life testing, threatening attack. So how do I identify that it's an actual attack scenario in a pen test which you're doing backend? And how would ask is, how would Synack approach today's cyber security issues? Will it be a mix and match of traditional pen test, or will you be using AI? Because for me, in the darknet, there are a lot of databases available. So how would you, presumably as a company, approach today's scenario on cyber security attacks?
Again, it's a very broad question, actually, and
I do it that way, since you guys are talking about broader views, yeah.
yeah. The thing is, what I like, so since I joined, so being in cybersecurity for a while, the model of Synack is entirely based on that trust element, and which is why I showed these 4 names that let's say I'm allowed to share. But it is a fact that most of our clients, it is a long-lasting relationship that we are engaging with. So it is a permanent working together in seeing what works, what doesn't work. For example, when it comes to the types of testing, let's shift left, or let's do that, or let's onboard also your development teams, get them closer and collaborate with the researchers. So all of these things are actually what we are bringing to the table. And when it comes to the researchers, how they are testing, for example, I got some examples again. It's another insurance, lots of insurance actually I'm dealing with here in Europe. But we are doing that standard testing, 50 researchers anytime on target, actively testing. Every 45 days, we are swapping them out. We are looking at the number of hours. Is it enough coverage? But now from the investment that the researchers are doing, so 82 countries, actually 83, I'm one of them, but actually I'm not a pen tester, but 82 countries are actually these ethical hackers, they are functioning differently. If, for example, you go to our website, acropolis.synack.com, you will find some names that may sound familiar to you also in your region. But these, when they are participating on the test, they look at it and there is some natural selection, first of all, happening. Some are saying, I see banking, I move away to the next assessment. So there is a natural selection happening. If they see, oh, there is an e-commerce platform and which is using these frameworks, which is using this as a backend, they are sticking to it. They're going to invest time. And what they are doing is they are not thinking as a blue team or a consultant. They are looking at it from a reward perspective, but also from a route. And they're looking at it, oh my God, this, I know that, and so this is so critical, and there may be some exploitable vulnerabilities in that. So actually that creativity that the Synack Red team puts actually to light is really what differs from the traditional approach. And so Bug Bounty has it all as well. So, but the Synack approach is really that more controlled environment. So we are typically dealing with environments where Bug Bounty, you wouldn't let them via an IPsec site-to-site VPN into your internal VLANs, for example, for doing internal infrastructure testing. Which we will be starting not very far away from UAE this week. So those are the kind of things that we are bringing to the table next. And then it's about that creativity and really that the Synack Red team is permanent coaching and really partnering with them and helping them improve. So Synack approach is really, we are all a big family. So the Synack Red team with Synack together.
Thanks a lot, Thomas. The only reason to raise this question on a wider scale of approach was from a customer point of view. If I am doing a handshake with a partner or a distributor who is in the cyber space, then I need to be at ease with the person. Yeah. So for me, it is more of testing and also trusting the pen test more than anything else. That's how I would start if I was the customer, which I am.
And maybe one more thing, the researchers that are working with us, we have a contractual relationship with them. And actually, the intellectual property of the finding goes to the client. So what bigger sign of trust from the researchers to the client that, you know, there are no bad mistakes happening, you know, 90 days after the report, I'm going to publish it. Oh, but we are not ready. I don't care. I can publish it because I have the right. So actually the transfer of intellectual property claims actually represents that trust that the researchers are putting into Synack, into the clients, and which the client can benefit. So win-win-win situation, actually, that's what is key for our part.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Thomas, for the questions. It's actually an interesting thought, like how do I test my testing vendor? I mean, it's a good one, very good, because it's kind of, yeah, it's excellent, it's excellent. Okay, Thomas, if you want to stop your screen share. Yeah, it's good. So, okay, so thank you very much. We're running a few minutes over. I do want to give the opportunity to have the whole panel here for some last minute questions. So if Chris is back And Thomas can be back with the camera on, and then I will ask Diraj and Tovik to join here up front. Yeah, and yeah, there should be all 4 of them. Chris is back. Actually, I didn't realize Chris came out of the hospital yesterday, so she didn't want to pass on being here this morning for us, early in the morning. So this is really appreciated, Chris. So I will, I'm not so important, but you guys are. So if you can stand from the camera, we can see if there's any last minute questions before we wrap up for the entire panel. So I will put the camera down a little bit so we actually, look at this, there you are. You have to come a little bit closer, you know, otherwise you looks like a giant, you know.
Right.
All right, any questions? The audience, from people online?
Okay.
Peter, any?
Yeah, so there are a few questions. Probably some of them are overlapping, but I mean, the first question is from where do you see the most malicious attacks traffic coming from, and what kind of attack types, and what is the best way to protect oneself? Yeah, it is a generic question. Anyone else have any comments?
Well, I know from my experience, we see a lot of attacks coming from the United States because there's a lot of internet connected assets. Quite a few from China as well. But just because there's a lot of attacks coming from those countries doesn't mean that it's coming from the government of those countries. But nowadays, attackers will use exploitable assets as proxies to launch their attacks. It makes it a bit cheeky and harder to actually see who's launching those attacks. It was more of a 4-part question. I don't really remember the other 3 parts of that 4-part question.
It was talking about the kind of attacks and the best ways to protect oneself.
A lot of the attacks are money related. If you ever want to know what kind of attacks are gaining a lot of leverage in the criminal hacking community, not the ethical hacking community, there's actually hacker genre music that goes and describes it. So some of the latest genre music, it's much like the narco music from Mexico, has been ransomware. Before that, it was still spam. A lot of spam attacks, but basically things that will make money. And some of the ways you can avoid this is, firstly, making sure that you know where what they call the low-hanging fruit is in your organization. Try to, firstly, get quick wins by closing those holes. And secondly, trying to make sure you know what assets, and that also includes software that's can be exploitable or easily exploitable is, so that you can mitigate that risk. Beyond that, some of the attacks that involve the end user are going to be more difficult. But one of 2 things that we found pretty successful at Aramco, one was make it easy for a person to report an email if they think it's suspicious. So we had a little button on the top of every email, and it would just be sent to the Security Operations Center. Secondly, reward employees or people who have somehow found very big things. So we had a security hero program where every month people who reported an issue were entered into a drawing and at the end of the month, they would or could win a pretty nice prize, like an iPad, for example. And the winner was also featured shaking the hand of a person from the security department and being given a certificate for being the security hero for that month. And it was used as well as the next year's employee evaluation, so they could get extra points, which could possibly lead to a raise for their performance evaluation. So don't be the security department with the big stick ready to hit people, but reward them for actions, and they'll be a lot more forthcoming with things that they find suspect.
Great. I think the next question is again an overlap of the previous question, but I'll just say it. It's do you have any insight on which assets are most targeted, that is web, mobile, or infrastructure? I think that's almost covered, but if you have anything to say in regards to that.
I think anything that's connected to the internet is a target. I don't think there's a specific, I mean, yes, I mean, mobile applications and web applications are more common because they're exposed to the internet, and, they're also sort of popularized through their respective companies. But I think anything that's connected to the internet, I'm damn sure if you put a toaster connect to the internet, somebody will pop, bread from that as well. So yeah, I think it's, as long as it's on the internet, it's a target for everything.
And actually, what we are seeing in our latest Von brief, mobile actually is mainly targeted. So actually, a very interesting finding that we have in our statistics. So mobile.
And the last and final question is, what is your perspective on continuous testing and how this can be practically deployed and managed? Go ahead.
I think continuous testing is very important, and every organization has a very unique posture for risk, appetite for risk, and I think you should work closely with your partners to see how best you can tailor the engagement model to be able to get the maximum benefit out of it. Well, I think that's a politically correct answer.
Anyone else?
Well, I think also continuous testing is very important when you've got a lot of third parties that are managing various parts of your infrastructure and suppliers as well. Because I think I said it before, it's so easy to make a keystroke error and suddenly your firewall's letting everything in, or suddenly you've just disabled a large portion of your antivirus or whatever it might be. So especially when you cannot control the assets which are outside of your control because of the overhead and the fact that most organizations use a third party. So continuous testing is very important in those places.
Chris, I have a last question. Botnets, I believe, can be hired so cheaply, and hacking software is so readily available in the market, as you know. But one moot question is that why are we talking about, we're talking about SaaS, we're talking about PaaS, infrastructure as a service, but what about attack as a service? I'm hearing a lot about this.
Yes.
It is.
Yes. There's
Tell
a
us more about this before we rush for lunch, because people are now
yes.
really looking at me. What questions are you asking, Guy?
So attackers as a service, there's a particular Central Asian country which has just gotten a new government, which is we're about to publish a paper on how they're using attackers as a service from a couple of other countries, particularly on social media and certain websites to spread misinformation about certain topics. And if it's just like any other organization, if you don't have the in-house talent, then you contract for it, right? Done. So you have hackers for hire, attacker groups for hire, etc. Even criminal hackers have to diversify their income.
Yeah, that's. Thanks a lot, Chris.
All right. I think we overstayed our time a little bit, but actually it's quite good for what is it, 2.5 hours. So thank you for all the speakers for being there. Chris for joining despite whatever. Thank you, Thomas, from dialing in from Luxembourg early. Thanking Diraj and thanking Tovik. I think Tovik, you also had something going on that you can't join later, right? So all these guys are, of course, extremely precious, busy, have no time. And they took the time to be here this morning. So a great thank you very much for being here. And I hope that all the attendees here in person and online have gained a lot of really interesting insights and information that will help them succeed better and more in the future. Thank you all. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.